So, I'm very glad to be able to introduce to you today Abigail Susik, who has come all the way, well, not all the way, she's come all the way, well, yes, all the way from Budapest, who normally operates in Oregon at the Willamette University, where she does art history. She is internationally renowned for her work in surrealism studies. I have brought some of her books here. One of them is really heavy now that I'm trying to lift it with 2 fingers. It's called Surrealist Sabotage and the War on Work. I'll pass it on. I want it back, especially now I've discovered it's so heavy. And this one is the most recent one, which she hadn't seen herself, apparently. But I already have a copy. It's called Surrealism, Bugs Bunny, and the Blues. If you wonder what that is about, check it out. And well, I can go on. She was one of the founders of the International Society for Surrealism Studies. If you think surrealism, you think Susik. So today she's going to talk about something we all thought we knew, but apparently are misunderstanding. Kitsch.
Thank you so
Without
much.
any further ado.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. Thanks for coming, everybody. I'm currently living in Budapest. As you can see, I have a fellowship at CEU, so I've just flown from that far away. I hope you won't hold that against me. But it's lovely to be back. This is my 3rd time in Iran, and I know some familiar faces here from the last time I was here in 2021 with a conference that was organized by Dr. Brewer and his students. And so it's just been a delight over more than a decade now to be a part of MDRN events and the European Avant-Garde and Modernism Studies events that Sasha is also a part of, and just a lovely community. And yeah, so it brings back some memories. And actually with that, this is a subject I've been working on for a really long time. It was related to my dissertation in art history in the United States. But it is something that I returned to recently, and I think it really has quite changed since I've become a mother. And that is something that's part of this talk is children. I'm a breastfeeding mom. I think a little positionality is important to talk about here. And also I just want to say that as an American, as I've been preparing this talk, I'm very much aware of the way in which this material relates to the interwar period, right? So after World War I, leading up to World War II, keeping in mind the death of Walter Benjamin at exactly my age, the age of 48, in 1940 in Spain. He took his own life on the run from fascists. And also Max Ernst here. If you don't know much about him, he's a German artist who did fight in World War I on the German side, then became basically a Dadaist and a Surrealist. He had a wife in the 20s who was a quite famous German art historian, Louise Strauss-Ernst, and they part ways. He breaks away from his family, and unfortunately she dies at the age of 50 in 1944 in Auschwitz. So I just want to have a little bit of framing for this talk when we think about the potential of childhood to possibly solve some of the problems of modernity or of existence itself, especially in this era in which violence toward children and the deaths of 200 children last week in Gaza are something we can't look away from. But let's get into the material, and I promise I won't be serious the entire time. But I think there's no way to approach this material without having that kind of greater historical consciousness of where we are in the present, right? So I'm going to read, but I promise I'll stop and not read the entire time, and there'll be various images, and so you'll have things to look at and think about. So. Some context. Max Ernst's name arises only a handful of times in Walter Benjamin's writings, yet Benjamin's conception of a specifically surrealist enactment of the outmoded, in German das Veraltete, was sparked due to his initial confrontation in 1925 with Ernst's reworkings of old-fashioned illustrations, and I'm going to show you these collages. This was well before Benjamin had looked into surrealist books, such as Louis Aragon's Le Paysan de Paris, which maybe you know, it's a great book, Paris Peasant, from 1926, and of course André Breton's Nadja from 1928, which she very famously writes about later on. So perhaps this is not surprising, since Ernst's collages of outmoded material from the second half of the 19th century are among the earliest expressions of a developing surrealist attraction to outmoded culture, sort of recently old culture, right? Not quite old, but getting there, something that is just recently out of date. This predates Benjamin's exploration of 19th century sites in Paris, such as the covered arcades, which he famously writes about later on, and which he's taking from, in terms of subject matter, Aragon's Paysans de Paris. So this is 3 years before that other work, right, in 1925, when he's beginning to think about Max Ernst, really early, some of the earliest reception writings on surrealism. So not long after the publication of Breton's own Surrealist Manifesto in 1924, Benjamin had already recognized in Ernst's collages a preoccupation with super-N-weighted material culture that would only later fully emerge as one of surrealism's defining characteristics. So let's go back to these guys here. Benjamin admired Ernst throughout the 1920s and 30s, comparing him to Picasso and Paul Klee. Max Ernst and Giorgio de Chirico were the only visual artists mentioned in Benjamin's 1929 surrealism essay, which is interesting. There, in that essay, Benjamin talks about the shortcomings of surrealist artworks. He critiques both Ernst and de Chirico, and he compares them to the grandeur of the city of Paris itself. So there's no competition for the lived experience in Paris for artists who are trying to make still artworks that would encompass that atmosphere. However, Benjamin's most specific commentary on Ernst appeared in conjunction with his initial appraisal of surrealism at the end of 1925, when he was collaborating with Franz Hessel on a German translation of some of Marcel Proust's multi-part À la recherche de temps perdu, In Search of Lost Time. And I don't mind those voices if we're going to get too hot. That's okay. That's fine. In July of that year, the very month that his application for tenure at the University of Frankfurt was denied, do you know Benjamin did not finish? He was denied tenure. So he dropped out of academia. He's writing about Proust. In this era, he's actually writing letters to Rainier Maria Rilke and Gershom Scholem, and he's mentioning his study of surrealism, right? So this is a kind of new thing just after the trauma of being kicked out of academia, basically, right, and leaving it. It's sort of this surrealism's approach of the dream realm is something that lures him into a new field of inquiry following this academic rejection. So in that summer of 25, following that trauma, he drafts this short essay, Traumkitsch, Dream Kitsch, Traumkitsch. And it is one of the first reception writings we have on surrealism by any writer. So it's very, very early. It signals a severance between his past research at the university and his post-academia life as a translator of literature and a commentator of contemporary culture. He's writing a lot of magazine articles and newspaper articles at this time. It's a little bit more popular in that regard then, right? It's something that would appeal to the populace in its subject matter. So this little essay, this Dream Kitsch essay, characterizes surrealism as surpassing romanticism and tapping into contemporary generational consciousness, which is perhaps, I think, an unsurprising perspective given his recent departure from academia. So the essay is actually not published until 1927, so there's a 2-year gap. And around that time, Benjamin reviews a book by the surrealist Philippe Soupeau, the French surrealist writer, and he also begins translating Aragon's Le Paysan de Paris into German, which I don't think was ever published. By then, Benjamin's colleagues were already beginning to respond to his provocative thoughts on surrealism in essays such as Ernst Bloch's on the images of nature since the end of the 19th century. If you know this little essay by Ernst Bloch, it's deeply indebted to Benjamin's early writings on surrealism. It's from 1927, and Sasha and I were discussing this today. The Frankfurt School in general, there was a lot of back and forth about these ideas, but Bloch was really looking at what Benjamin was doing. Bloch was also looking at Ernst's surrealist collages as a two-dimensional form of ruin. He talks about two-dimensional paperworks as ruins, essentially. It's fascinating. But 2 years earlier, this Dream Kitsch essay had already begun to conceptualize the relationship of the image to time and materiality in its consideration of Paul Eluard's proto-surrealist volume of poems, this one, Répétition from 1922, which included these wonderful collage illustrations, some of which I'll show you, by Ernst, And Benjamin was fascinated particularly because they evoked the state and consciousness of childhood for him. So that really is key here. How many of you know this little book? It's obscure / not obscure, depending on what you work on, if you work on surrealism. Okay. Well, just to be clear, it's from 22-21, right? They do it in 21, they publish it in 22. And that predates the birth of surrealism in France in 1924, right? It's proto-surrealist. This is a whole discussion. They're moving towards surrealism. But the manifesto, the Bureau of Surrealist Research, doesn't get founded in Paris until 1924. So we're talking about a lot of date nuances here, but essentially what Benjamin is doing is a very early response to the earliest stirrings of what's later called surrealism. So in this little essay, Dream Kitsch, Traum Kitsch, Benjamin associates this book with surrealism, and he also links it directly to Breton's manifesto, which had just been published a year earlier. Also to an essay by Aragon. It's a wonderful essay called Un vague de rêve, a wave of dreams, which is about this kind of, the surrealist kind of swimming in the unconscious, so to speak. So in particular, this essay by Benjamin is reminiscent of the connection that Breton makes toward the beginning of the 1924 manifesto between childhood and the surrealist approach to language and the removal of restriction. So there's something about the way that children approach text and image that possibly could be liberatory for Breton, and Benjamin picks up on this. Breton spends a lot of the time in the manifesto talking about children. So for Breton, surrealists seek a liberated form of language without reservations. He says, ce langage sans réserve, which in an almost animate fashion can instruct children in the process of continual relearning, réapprendre, to relearn. So this kind of renewal of understanding continually. And then Benjamin derives this focus on dreams from Aragon and Breton's tracks. He arrives at this thought on the obsolescence of modernity, arguably from their vividness and nuance related to these collages. So here's a close-up of the cover collage by Ernst. So it's as if Benjamin is reading Breton's manifesto and then combining it with his reception of these very strange collages by Ernst, and I'll show you some more in a moment. Here's one. And he's pushing that into a new kind of consciousness about what looking at such images can do for us. So I'll show you just a few of them now in case you don't know them. So what Ernst has done here is take old collages from the 19th century, popular illustrations from magazines and pulp novels, cut them up, sometimes adding pen markings, and then republishing them so you cannot see how they were made, right? You can't see the cuts. You can't see what was added in pencil. So they look like a whole. They don't have that kind of surgical operation. And Benjamin actually assumed that these were drawings when he looked at them. And that's what he writes about in this Traum Kitsch essay, in this Dream Kitsch essay. He thinks that they've been drawn from Ernst's consciousness, and yet he's also aware of the way in which they invoke old culture. So this one, it is published, and Repetition is about this big, the little book that Benjamin's looking at and probably holding. He's a bibliophile, as you know, so he was collecting surrealist texts. But this one is published horizontally, as you see it here on the screen. And some of them, along with this particular frontispiece that Benjamin is looking at, do specifically invoke imagery of children or childhood, right? But in general, for Benjamin, there was something about this that related to childhood consciousness, not just the depiction of children, but more than that. But it was this image, and it's a little hard for you to see, and I'm going to give you a close-up in a second. It was this one that he really focused on. This frontispiece depicting these schoolboys and a teacher in this hallucinatory classroom, like this one, right? Scrutinizing this scene, which conjured reminiscences of his childhood, Benjamin arrived at his first conclusions about surrealism's attraction to this thing he called the outmoded, das Veraltete, and what this preoccupation meant for European culture at large at the interwar period. So he writes about it, and this is from the essay here, Dream Kitsch, Gloss on Surrealism. Max Ernst has drawn 4 small boys. Drawn, right? It's a collage. He didn't know that. They turn their backs to the reader, to their teacher, and his desk as well, and they look out over a balustrade where a balloon hangs in the air. A giant pencil rests on its point on the windowsill. The repetition of childhood experience gives us pause. When we were little, there was as yet no agonized protest against the world of our parents. As children in the midst of that world, we showed ourselves superior. When we reach for the banal, we take hold of the good along with it. The good that is there, open your eyes right before you. So, Dream Kitsch is a really short essay, actually, and it's largely been ignored or overlooked in the Benjamin's reception, which I think is understandable, but also in the field of surrealism studies. But it's this kind of explosive little kernel that I cannot resist, and especially this sort of strange compound idea of dream kitsch is extremely difficult to tease out. So there's an ekphrasis, a description of the image by Benjamin in the essay, and it's brief. But he's focusing on how children can make the world around them good, no matter how shitty it is. And so opposed to this two-sided nature of parental authority and love, which is sentimental and heartfelt, but also restrictive and instrumentalized, it's a controlling form of affection that has a visual correlate in kitsch. So that's a very strange leap, right? How does conditioning, parental conditioning, social mores, societal forms of conformity, how does that relate to the visual and the material world, or this thing called kitsch? He talks about it as a crimped picture puzzle filled with ornament. Maybe some of these are a little bit better when we think about something like that. This is sort of also speaking about pedagogy in general, the way that we teach children through images and how they learn to speak through books, etc. It's commenting on that kind of canned way in which children receive information through education, and which we all do, right? So let's go back here and look a little bit more at this image that he's really focusing on, this one. Benjamin's feeling that children resolve the conflict between love and control that their parents exude through a creative process called dialogic misunderstanding. That's his phrase. And what is that? Right. So they transform their parents' tacky visual puzzles and illustrations and children's books into their own dreamlike vista that they actually project into and remake on their own. It's this kind of incredible theory of projective consciousness. So this description of this frontispiece, which is at the very beginning of the book in Eluard and Ernst's book Repetitions, functions as a figure of thought, something like a denkbeeld, which is a word used by the scholar Sigrid Wiegel. She defines denkbeeld, or thought image, as, quote, images in relation to which thoughts and theoretical reflections unfold, Benjamin's in particular, and also as images whose representations are translated into figures of thought. So the image produces thought and then also cycles back on itself to create representation. So I think it's obvious where do I want to be right here. Yes, I think I'm on the right image, that there's a relationship here to things that Benjamin does with other images. And so, let me stay here for a moment, I'm sorry. So this is prefiguring some of his later writings in which images play a specific role in the elaboration of his criticism. So as a trial foray into this technique of literary montage, Benjamin is mostly doing this in the arcades in the 1930s, but Traumkitsch, this Dream Kitsch essay, is the beginning of this kind of thought process for Benjamin. It's experimental, a pictographic mode of theory, right, by which you push your thinking through the image. A scholar named Brigitte Doherty, who worked quite a bit on Benjamin, pointed to this obscure concept of Benjamin's that she called literary montage. That's a translation of something called colportage. Have you ever heard of this, if you're interested in Benjamin? So this idea that there's a generally accepted definition that a splicing of texts and citations emphasize the centrality of certain images and image text in his thought processes. So this is about the relationship of image to text. It's a literary type of montage that is founded in part upon Benjamin's study of imagistic allegories in his ill-fated thesis on the German Baroque Trauerspiel, right, which was not published initially for him. It was written between 24 and 25, so right at the same time. This Traum Kitsch essay offers a rare example in which Benjamin is thinking about a 20th century work of art, not a Baroque work in this period, to push his thought forward. So one thing that really fascinates me is that there was no publication of the Ernst frontispiece when Traum Kitsch originally appears in 1927 in a German newspaper. It's in Die Neue Rundschau in 1927. But, as you can see, I think here, and when I found this I was shocked, he reuses it in his publication in 1929 of his very famous essay on surrealism, which comes out in another newspaper, the Literarische Welt, which he wrote for extensively at this time. It's how he made his money, right? He was gigging, doing paid writing in the press. This was a time when you could actually earn a living writing cultural criticism. That was pretty challenging, and so he reuses it there. I think this is really key. And this is a close-up of it. You can barely see it, and it says there that it's a surrealist drawing, not a collage. He doesn't understand this by Max Ernst. He doesn't know Max Ernst. He hasn't seen the originals. So he's not able to ask Ernst, how did you make this? Where did you get this from? He assumes it's a drawing rather than cut papers. And so what does this mean that he re-includes it here? In this essay, he brings it back in. And also, how can we think about this in relationship to other famous works of art in Benjamin's oeuvre that are specifically from the 20th century, most famously like Klay's Angelus Novus here from 1920, which Benjamin owned. He owned this work of art, which is a transfer watercolor by Klay. And then, of course, he honored it famously in a passage in this late unpublished essay, of course, very famous now, on the concept of history from 1940, the year of his death. So, but, long before that, in this brief period of time we have with him before he dies, he gives us this Traum Kitsch essay with this focus on this bizarre little collage by Ernst. So what can this frontispiece tell us about his concept of dream kitsch, which still eludes us, and I think always will? At the heart of Benjamin's reception of French surrealism is this concept of the movement as a remedy of the problem for imposed kitsch and its psychic somatic implication for both children and adults. The kitsch that forms the preliminary basis for the critical experience of Traum Kitsch is on the most basic level a ubiquitous form of modern materiality that is banal, familiar, time-worn, and cheap. In contrast, Benjamin's dream kitsch theorized an experimental form of post-consumption. So what you do with things after they've already been consumed and received. How can the consumer alter something creatively against the grain to their own advantage or pleasure? This is a belated and aberrant form of de-instrumentalized consumption, right? Sort of non-capitalist consumption, if you will, occurring after a commodity's novelty value has faded. Post-consumption simultaneously served as a means of psychic rehabilitation from bourgeois social conditioning in the theory that he's building, and I argue, and a path toward renewed subject-object relations, liberated from the seductions of desirable commodities. So there's a paradoxical utility that Benjamin sees in these old commodities, recently outdated, or visual culture for that matter, that have recently, in the last 30 to 80 years or so, outrun its newness and outrun its intended function on a kind of market and capitalism's hectic turnover. So to ignite this critical potential of dream kitsch, Benjamin postulates commercial entities that date from just a few generations prior, no more than that, right? They can't be too old, could later be reconsumed by subsequent generations to awaken the kind of long dormant memories of childhood. So primacy of childhood, immediacy with object relations, linguistic freedom, whether these memories were personal or collected based on the childhood experiences of the self or previous generations. For Benjamin, this idea that the dream was accessible if triggered, right? This state of the childhood dream showed that the dream was first and foremost actually a historical phenomenon. So think about that. What does that mean to say the dreams you had last night are actually historical phenomena? What does that even mean, right? Are our dreams pure, or how filtered are they through not just our experiences, but through the context that we live in? It's really complex thinking on his part. So this is a kind of liberatory post-consumption that ironically depends on this claustrophobic descent, and I'm going to go back a little bit to the other collages, this descent into this storehouse of outmoded junk and sentimental kitsch that creates this dialogic misunderstanding of capitalist kitsch. So what I'm trying to set up is an opposition between dream kitsch, Benjamin, and capitalist kitsch, right? Benjamin is trying to recuperate, if you will, maybe that's not the right word, to take capitalist kitsch, the crap that's all around us, and make it something explosive and revolutionary through this way that it might trigger the past for us. A past that's almost inaccessible, the past of childhood. Endless kitsch, an increasingly time-worn world of parents, grandparents, and aging generations. This was a dialectic that opened onto liberation precisely because it was already familiar and cozy, right? So you had to move through nostalgic sentimentality in order to access a resistant part of your psyche. This is a kind of maybe therapeutic line of thought that I'm talking about here. And so social conditioning from childhood is akin to a kind of restrictive tether that's disguised by kitschy sentimentality. So if we take that kitschy sentimentality, that kind of form of hidden control back on, possibly we could go back into this childlike space. It's a counter kitsch in that regard, right? So he's doing some twists and turns here. He talks about, and I think this image is great for it, the furnished man. Have you heard of this Benjaminian idea? That this is an idea that the modern consciousness, certainly in the 1920s for him, is so filled with the reality of commodities and what you might call skeptical culture that we don't even have a kind of pure sense of individual consciousness, right? That we are fully kind of programmed. Dream kitsch for Benjamin demands a psychic submission to the personal past, as well as a projection onto the simultaneously personal and collective childhood experiences for the collective. So I'm going to move on from these images in a second, but bear with me. Art historians are nervous if we're not constantly showing you images. So, but I think it's important to kind of try to expand on what he's talking about here. He conjectured that children were so profoundly absorbed in the material world around them that their individuality remained indistinct and unformed. This childhood predilection for mimesis and synergy with the object world was for Benjamin a euphoric overcoming of the quotidian ennui and sameness of kitsch. But his frontispiece simultaneously triggers traumatic memories of the inevitable disempowerment that comes with childhood. So sympathy, love, sentimentality is also standardized in its attempt to disguise adult efforts at the control of children. So these themes originated for Benjamin's close engagement, during Benjamin's close engagement with the German youth movement, and also the ideas of Gustav Weineken before World War I, as seen in his early essays critiquing the concept of progress. Before his break with Weineken's epistemologies, Benjamin participated in collective critique of traditional pedagogical systems. And he talks about, this is essentially, Dream Kitsch is essentially a critique of this pedagogical world in Germany. But he's also writing, as you may know, a bunch of other essays that focus on youth and childhood at this time. The metaphysics of youth, a child's view on color, and then as he becomes a father, this kind of builds in terms of his interest in children's books in particular. By the mid-1920s, psychoanalysis had also become a palpable influence for him, and the close correlation of childhood memories with psychic projection and the uncanny return here into this essay in Dream Kitsch. But it takes a little bit longer in his thought for truly Freudian theories to come in. So what I'm saying is the 1925 essay on Dream Kitsch is it's part of an evolving set of theories that predated and postdated in terms of his relationship with psychoanalysis and his thought on children in general. And so this rationalized standardization of childhood conditioning in the classroom for him is transformed into a space of liberation for the child via specifically the didactic tools of juvenile storytelling and illustration. The writing surface depicted in the graphic image, and there's one here that I'll talk about more, becomes a play space, what Benjamin would later recall a Spielraum, space for play, starting in 1935. Just as the illustration of the classroom itself morphs from an advertisement into hallucination through the action of the artist's overpainting technique, which I will talk about a little bit more momentarily. So, Let's go back here. So, Ernst's artworks for repetitions were combined ready-made material with artistic intervention, thereby creating an unusual hybrid form in which the found and the created coexist. Ernst actually constructed these collages and the frontispiece that Benjamin is focusing on from wood-engraved advertisements originally published as teaching aids in a catalog that was used in tertiary education in Germany in the early 20th century. Titled in some accounts of Ernst's work as Bibliotheca Pedagogica, and there's another title in German as well. It appears at the end of the late 19th century and then it's just kind of republished as a pedagogical manual over and over into the pre-World War I period. So this is something that both Benjamin and Ernst would have shared, right? They're roughly the same age. And Ernst is actually using the most recent edition of this kind of old teaching catalog from 1914 in his collages. So it's really familiar. It's 10 years old, but it has an older heritage. Across the pages of this really strange teaching manual catalog, some of which are rendered in color, but mostly in black and white, you see these myriad illustrations of plant and animal life, domestic and scientific things, displayed side by side as a printer's source of material for school primers and assignments. So it's truly kitsch. These images would have been seen over and over by children across Germany at this time. And they were made, kind of ready-made for consumption by children and youth. Rules of scale and classification are set aside in the space of this book so that the inventory of worldly things can be compactly rendered for the printer's advantage. Likewise, given the original serial format of the publication, there are advertisements such as the one that Ernst chose, as you can see here, for the frontispiece of Repetitions. It's a 4.5-inch little advertisement for Mr. Koenig's retractable wall blackboard. We need one in here. We have one right there. And then you see these 4 boys, right? So they were actually working on arithmetic at the board. So Ernst discovers this catalog in 1919, and he's still working in Dada at the time. It's Cologne Dada. Not a well-known chapter of Dada's history, but an important one of my favorites. And he talks about this in his autobiography, Beyond Painting, of seeing these old illustrations, not that old, from his childhood, and then having this kind of eureka moment where he realizes he can use them, he can dictorium them, if you will, for his work. This is the origin of his engagement with collage, is this experience. And so these kinds of texts were ubiquitous, although they were already becoming outmoded because of the print process, right? This wood engraving is something that by the World War I period is already losing sway as something that's commonly used in mass printing. So they had this kind of old sheen already. This is a little bit more of a close-up of it here. I wonder how popular it was as a product. I don't know, I'm not going to try to get into that in my research, this retractable wallboard. It seems very useful. So in 1922, when this book, Repetitions, was published that Benjamin falls in love with and writes about his very first thoughts on surrealism concerning this book, Ernst was mostly actually using found material from this French journal, La Nature, which was mass-published, mostly 19th century publication that's, kind of like National Geographic, with black and white engraved illustrations that show pretty cool things, like scientists working with laboratory instruments and all kinds of experiments. He uses it extensively. So the focus on this pedagogical manual is less common in his collages at the time, but Benjamin seizes on it in his imagination, right? He seizes on this particular frontispiece. And so I do want to point out as well, this frontispiece is different from the other collages in the book, and I think you've noticed that. It's not just in color, and that is the main difference. But can you see it's also painted on? So it's not purely cut papers with maybe some ink addition, it's got gouache, it's a kind of thick watercolor. And that's what Benjamin has used to disguise the Rollwandtafel, right? To turn the Rollwandtafel into this dreamscape, which is part of, for Benjamin, he didn't know this image, I'm sure the original image, he had no idea. Remember, he thinks it's a drawing, but there's something that's conjured there. There's something that's remembered and forgotten at the same time. You know how you've forgotten something and then you see it and you're like, oh yeah, I actually do know that thing. You remember what you've forgotten, what you remember. That's what's happening for Benjamin here. And so I think as the case is in general with this is a medium that's later called overpainting by art historians, overpainting. What is painted out plays as important a role as what is painted in, because he does add stuff too, as you can see. And so we lose the writing of the original advertisement, but we gain this, this dreamscape that the children are creating as they work in this kind of rote repetition of mathematics. That the body, the boredom of the classroom, I hope you're not too bored right now. If you're looking out the window, it's fine, you should be. That's what Benjamin wants and what I want for you. But it's boring, right? I mean, education is a kind of restriction. I mean, mass education can be considered a form of confinement while workers are at the factory, right? It's a work day. And so Benjamin is so excited by this possible transformation of basically the machine that makes children conform to our modern workaday capitalist world. And so there are differences with the collage, obviously, many differences. And then I think also, as you can see, this is the kind of panorama of what's in the book. And I think in general what I want to say is that for Benjamin, all of these collages, especially the frontispiece, kind of open onto a collective past, a collective memory. He's already interested in child psychology, as I've said, by 1913. And by the time his son is born in the early 20s, and like me, he's thinking about children because of that, he begins collecting books, children's books, mostly from the 19th century, and his collection is magnificent but small, and I'll turn to that. But also, he systematically begins writing these multiple essays on childhood, and I want to talk about some of the ones that are later on in his writing. So Stefan, his son, is born in 1918, and let's see, this is the depiction of the children. I think this might be most of them, of the books he collects in this period. German, I think it's almost exclusively German children's books. Does anybody know this collection well? I've never perused it. There are about 200 of them, and they are preserved, as you can see, in Frankfurt, and currently they are preserving them and then digitizing all of them, which is great. But you can see he was quite interested in brightly colored illustrations and really older books, because as you know, the childhood industry was invented in the late 18th century, really, right? Children as a type of person, as a category, that's a modern idea. And so the commodity market that went with that was also something that was inherently modern. It, and particularly in Germany, dates to the mid-19th century. He has some older things as well. Like for instance, this is an example, particularly hallucinogenic one that I adore, from one of his books. I'll show you the cover of it, that he uses in one of his essays. And before I left X, the social media platform, I posted this, and it had like 2,000 likes in one day. The image was something really powerful about this image, I think. And so Benjamin looked at these books, and he saw in them already a kind of surrealism. So he's looking at this before he encounters surrealism. And when he sees the Ernst book with Eluard, it triggers already, what is going on in his mind. So it's just perfect for a day like this, right? This kind of amazing, brightly colored image that you can project into almost to a different time and space. And so he actually hoped to open a secondhand bookshop specializing in rare editions, particularly children's texts at this time. He's a new dad. He's thinking, how can I earn some money, be helpful, get out of the house a little bit? It never pans out. But he does have, his collection includes some Dutch works as well. But this hobby also leads to an interest in antique toys, children's theater, and radio programming, which is all represented in his writings from the 1920s. Now, mostly you probably know Benjamin is a workaholic like myself, so he just is mostly writing at this time, but the objects help him push his ideas. So he writes in 1918 notes for a study of the beauty of colored illustrations in children's books. I have to tear you away from this. Sorry, I'm going to go here. Yeah, stay here. And he talks about works of art like this one. There are no illustrations in that essay, which is unpublished. But it's a year before Tom Kitsch, before the other essay I've been discussing. He also talks about Karl Hobrecker's book, Old Forgotten Children's Books, which was a German book that was published in 1924. He reviews it, and there he sets the stage for his first reception of surrealism in Ernst, by distinguishing between older children's books of the late 18th century and the early 19th century from the most recent books that are coming out. And he has a critique there. He feels that these older books somehow are offering kind of less kitschy subject matter or imagery for the child to project into. He's concerned at the mass market of teaching aids and children's literature that is just kind of force-feeding information into children's heads and kind of basically brainwashing them in a way. He talks about the degraded level of kitsch. So the main fault of these newer children's books was that they had become self-consciously childlike and therefore false in their forced jolliness. Now, I think this one would have been accepted for Benjamin, and he doesn't write specifically about an image like this. But I think this would have been the good kind of image for him. But increasingly, with the turn of the 20th century, there's this kind of forced cheerfulness. And this changes the way that the children encounter them, and therefore the way that their minds are shaped. This literally determines how society forms for him. He's thinking on, it's kind of very dramatic in a way what he's thinking. So something about this book by Eluard and Ernst is pushing backward into another time, into an earlier, not only consciousness, but a way of adults approaching children, this strange species called children. He says, the surrealists have copied Nachgezeichnete, the picture book. They have fashioned fantasy images, he says, which relate in a pictographic manner to the abstruse maxims, Sinnspulka, of their poetry. And so he really focuses on this sole color image because the frontispiece with the gouache, because for him, actually, it's color images that have the most powerful effect on children's brains. It's what allows them to transform the visual material or the prefab material, if you will, into the dreamscape. And so just here, has anybody seen this book? I actually haven't read it, but there's apparently kind of a comic book related to Walter Benjamin, if you really want to get deep into it. And in that book, the author and artist talks about this theory that he has of the color of children's books. Something about the color triggers the brain to make these kinds of leaps from the still image into a kind of living image that you can actually put yourself into. Also, and I haven't read it, by the way, I don't know how good it is, but so Benjamin says that Ernst and Eluard's book is like a leporello, which is a beautiful fancy word for an accordion book. I think there were actually books made in the early 20th century that had accordion piece, like the musical instrument on either side, and you pulled them out like this. I'm not a literary historian. But, and they're also, they're called zigzag books as well. There are several names, or panorama books, maybe related to the history of photography. Concertina book is another name for this. But he's thinking that even though this little book doesn't have anything like this going on, it's a little bit like the earliest forms of fold-out illustration. So there were, in the 19th century, books that had moving parts for children, right, or pop-up books, as they call them. And this is an example of a paper peep show that was meant for children. That this is as old as the 1820s that you would pull out, and then the child could look into it and see a projection, right? So the collages obviously aren't that, but they have this kind of kinetic quality for Benjamin, and he's relating them to optical illusions, visual puzzles, trick pictures, rebuses, pictographs, and other kind of ludic schema that are meant for children. And in a third essay on children's literature, which is called A Glimpse into the World of Children's Books, Aussicht im Kinderbuch, that was published in 1926, he extends this concept of a subverted kitsch, a dream kitsch, and he leans on this idea of visual perception and memory in relationship to word, image, and color. He talks about a phenomenological view of this peculiar childhood rapport with text and illustrations, and this project by which a child enters into an image both psychically and physically. So for him, there's a way in which he is theorizing a kind of, time-space projection into colored illustrations. Sadly, when these various essays were published by him, if they were published in this era, and he was really fighting to get published to earn money and survive, they were always in black and white. So the very thing he's talking about is kind of reduced to this really super drab vision, but you can see what he's going for, and it's great at all that they had images, I think, but we need to kind of think about these in the way that he wanted them, with this extreme kind of vividness of the ones that I showed you before. I'm just giving you some close-ups here. So these are selections from his library. Very personal, right? This is a very strange text. This is a kind of another kind of very early form of a pedagogical catalog that's teaching children to learn through pictures, sort of like an alphabet book that teaches the letter with, an apple associated with the A, etc. This is an early version of that. And so, it's striking that such graphic surface alterations hearkened directly to him for Ernst's work and the advertisement in Bibliotheca Pedagogica of the blackboard that we looked at. So Benjamin's theory of childhood absorption into text, absorption and projection, in these other essays probably incorporated the lessons he had already learned in this earlier essay, Kitsch. Like the playfully destructive measures of a child who claims a favorite illustration by appropriating it for their own purposes, Ernst's frontispiece is a ludic revision of the advertisement. And some of these illustrations for him bear a striking resemblance to things that Benjamin was already collecting, right? And so, for instance, this is the glimpse into the world of children's books that's showing the cover of the book that I've already given you a taste of with the umbrellas, right? So this is the cover. This is a little close-up for you if you wanted to see it better in the original publication. I think it's really important to actually look at Benjamin's original publications if you can, and just get a sense of what it was actually like when it came out. But then if you go to the object, you can see, I think, this one is actually a lot more like the like the Ernst frontispiece. It has that kind of strange, sanguine, calm, but totally bizarre and weird atmosphere. And as you can see, he chooses the cover of the book for this particular essay. And just for fun, I'll show you a few more pages. The Magical Red Umbrella from 1881, which is clearly kind of got that same vibe, this kind of sleepy, dreamy vibe. Here are some more pictures from it. Worthy of Henry Darger, if you know who that American artist is, a kind of naive artist. Here are a couple more. And this one, which I think is arguably definitely not kitschy. It's just creepy. It's kind of like scary in the way that Grimm's would have been, for children, where the child, my son is 2.5, he loves to be scared when he looks at it. He's already a baby, we try to protect him from it, but he wants to be a little bit scared sometimes when he reads his books. Now Benjamin wanted that kind of lack of conditioning. He wanted us to back off the children's imagination, very understandably. But he thought there was more at stake than just our children. For him, this meant like all of society, like a way to actually escape our own problems as adults. Certainly a redemptive idea. And so there were essays like this one also, What Our Grandparents Racked Their Brains Over. Another example of Benjamin really being excited by older visual culture, such as puzzles and rebuses, which I guess would have been popular in mass publications with the general public. And maybe because they were pictorial largely and not just textual. And he doesn't talk about surrealism here or Max Ernst, but this is all kind of in the same wheelhouse for him, right? So these puzzles, Ratzabilds, help us move away from, he says, the most abysmal entanglements, help us break away from the known and the conscripted. Adult hegemony is something that he's thinking about here. The riddle, this misunderstanding of the known, the attempt to understand through misunderstanding, deciphering, trying to solve problems, extends this idea of dream kitsch as a kind of oppositional approach to given materials. And so back to the frontispiece, he says, quote, "This all in order to blaze away into the heart of things abolished or superseded, to decipher the contours of the banal as rebus, to start a concealed William Tell from out of the wooded entrails, or to be able to answer the question, where is the bride?" End quote. Now, it's like almost impenetrable, this quote. But for him, surrealism blazes away into the core of the outmoded, slightly old visual and material culture for a joint process of identification and reclamation. Ernst's frontispiece reclaims the rebus on behalf of the child's imagination by substituting open-ended fantasy for mathematical solutions and inchoate imaginings for the whole picture. Fittingly, such a process of substitution and revision for Ernst's frontispiece resembles some of Benjamin's descriptions of child behaviors toward illustrations and puzzle, as in when they revise what they see in an attempt to understand it. So children inherently do this for him. So this is a sort of series of essays by him on children, children's literature, children's illustrations that can help us understand what drew him to surrealism, right? It's key if we want to understand why he was so crazy about surrealism starting in 1925 and arguably for the rest of his life. And it begins here with this image. So I'm going to conclude there shortly, but I just want to say a few more remarks about these two fellows and this encounter. And they did meet later on, but they never knew each other well, if you're curious about that. Benjamin kind of circulated around the surrealists, but usually sort of stayed aloof. He was in Paris a lot. He did meet Breton briefly, but he chose to remain quite independent and to keep his distance, in fact. But as examples of technological media processes and cultural trends that were less than a century old, juvenile textual and visual culture was in essence modern in many senses of the word for him. This is a question of modernity. But by the post-war period, these print games had already been rendered obsolete by several factors, right? And so, what does the connection reveal about the phenomenon of dream kitsch as a prefiguration of the later concept of the surrealist outmoded? In many senses, it is arguable that the key to this connection hinges on Benjamin's critique of kitsch in the essay. Although kitsch, as it is theorized in later essays of the 1920s and 30s, had many revolutionary sides for Benjamin, so capitalist kitsch, such as its ability to unravel the aloof superiority embodied in the idea of fine art or high art, and its proximity to working-class popular culture. Here, in Dream Kitsch, the Dream Kitsch essay, kitsch is conceived of as a potentially detrimental category, linked on a basic level to the bad taste that accompanied kitsch's coinage in the mid-19th century in Germany. So Germany is considered to be the birthplace of both the word and the concept of kitsch. It's a German word, obviously. But the concept itself comes out of German mass visual and commodity culture of the mid-19th century. Kitsch becomes something that turns toward bourgeois rigidity, compulsiveness, and concealed authoritarianism. So here I'm linking back to what I said earlier about what he's hoping to do with this. And basically, I think that Benjamin believes that children can save the world, or save the world from capitalism, right? I think he's already I know that's kind of a big statement, but I think he already in 1926 is kind of Marxist enough and perhaps fatalist enough to think that we need to push through capitalism somehow, and that children might offer the answer, not just for a different kind of consciousness, but for a way of negotiating the world around us. And so first of all, we should back off of sort of training them and forcing them into our way of living, our way of thinking, but also that we should re-enter their state of mind through perhaps, older culture that would allow us to get there more directly. So it's an interesting concept, and one that I would love to hear what you think of. Could we be saved by children or by understanding this category of humans as something that could make us more human ourselves? So this week, for me, that has even more resonance when children are being attacked on all sides by modern life. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Abigail. This was a wonderful talk. Are there any questions, suggestions, remarks? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for that fascinating talk. I know very little about Michael Benjamin, and this was fascinating. Delightful.
He is delightful.
The first thing is a comment, which is I recognize that blackboard. It populates my internal kitsch of having grown up in German schools.
That's amazing.
They are everywhere.
So they still exist, or is it?
They roll up and down, and they fold in on either side, and they have little like math graphs on one side, and sometimes they have lines.
What are they made of? Like it's a
green.
screen.
They tend to be green.
It's green, okay,
It's
not
green.
black, okay.
No.
Okay, that's really helpful.
Yeah.
And so you can actually like write on it with chalk and erase it like a normal.
Yeah. It's a normal blackboard. It just has that mechanism. It's in most German universities as well, actually.
Someone get me a picture. That's amazing.
Yeah. The other thing actually was in response to your last remarks about the sort of development of children and so on. And I'm wondering, is there a lineage from Benjamin to say, or do you know if there's a lineage from Benjamin to later movements around unschooling, homeschooling, etc.? Is this a well-known part of his thought, or is it quite?
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm really not a Benjamin expert, and I think in a way he was drawing more on discussions about pedagogy from his era than anyone drew from him in that regard later on. Does anybody have an answer to that question? Does anybody know if people incorporated Benjamin into pedagogical or any kind of theory of childhood experience? I don't believe that's the case. I think I don't know what you would say, Sasha, but I think it's fairly obscure in terms of a really important aspect of his thought, especially in a practical way. But do you have any connections any thoughts about how?
I also grew up around a lot of people having mad ideas about what schooling should be, so I was just personally curious as well, but I suppose there's so many of these radical unschooling movements that populate the second half of the 20th century and today that I was just curious.
I don't know if they draw on him at all or if these things remain kind of obscure because, as you can see, they were published in all of these, newspapers, kind of just, one that you pick up on the street. It's, or subscribe to, kind of bourgeois intellectual newspapers, but they wouldn't have been collected. I mean, they weren't translated into English, I think, until 2001 was the year that found Kitsch in the collected writings. There's a series of volumes where a lot of these essays were translated for the first time into English, and that's when I became aware of the Dream Kitsch essay and have loved it ever since. I think it's just so important. It's like a sparkling little jewel of an essay. It's so short, I just gave you a 45-minute talk on something that's like, 2 pages, but it's just explosive the way his writing is. There's, you have to, in order to really get Benjamin, you just have to kind of go deeper and deeper into the multiple references and ideas. But I think it's actually still, I definitely been thinking about childhood, and I think about his focus on memory in Berlin and, the way that memory relates to, his love of books, but maybe not so much these particular theories about the problems of education. And he's not just talking about the classroom, and that's clearly key with the repetitions book. He's also thinking about parents and what we do at home with our children, and that more intimate level. And we do it, and we're reading with our son constantly, explaining the images, and so it's something that no matter what we do, it's there. And I do want to mention, I didn't mention this before, that Benjamin, in my opinion, was a bad dad. He leaves. We talked about, there were surely reasons that I wasn't there. I don't know, but he leaves his family. He abandons his son and partner. And moves to France, and he's spending a lot of time writing this stuff. I mean, he needs to do it for a living, but he's writing it when his son is a little boy. So now I'm writing too right now, but I just think that's important to mention in terms of the gender politics behind the production of some of these ideas, how he was attempting to relate to his own child in real time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It was really fascinating, fascinating visual material as well. So
good, I'm so glad.
The quality of the image is also astounding. So it's a beautiful discovery for this time.
There's one really bad one. The Benjamin, I could not get it. I just want to show you really quick. Sorry for interrupting. This is a bad quality image.
That's okay.
Because I wanted one from the 20s.
The rest makes up for this one exception. No, I have a small. The question is about nostalgia, and I know it's a complicated word to bring up with Benjamin because it's more often associated with all these theories around melancholy and memory. So precisely all sorts of ways that we don't want to talk about nostalgia. as something that would be more conservative, let's say.
Yes.
But at the same time, it's quite striking that he positions an understanding of childhood or a kind of celebration of childhood and what childhood can do in a kind of present world and in complex interworld context. But at the same time with a celebration of past forms of childhood that he himself experienced, so more perhaps in the adult recognition of something that you've seen as a child and the return to a kind of experience of childhood that is something that children don't experience in the present. So it's also it's a celebration of childhood that is again childhood not being lived but as something that you recollect. And that's maybe also the complexity of childhood that it can only be embraced or thought of once it's past. It's a complicated experience. But sorry, it's a bit of a meandering question.
No, it's perfect for Benjamin. It follows the thought.
And what I was wondering is how it relates to the as you described it. I'm very interested in this concern, the mass market production of children's books that rise at the period. Because indeed the interwar is a moment where you have a huge development of new forms of children's productions, children's magazines that start to be
it's a huge industry.
There's indeed all sorts of new pedagogies from Montessori, Freinet and so on that embrace print culture in different ways, where you find a lot of rebus, a lot of new forms of children entertainment that combine text and image. And I'm wondering why does he grasp back to this old culture, and is there no hope for the, let's say, modern capitalist production?
I mean, and this is too, right? I mean, this is high capitalism in Germany. I've gotten comfortable over my life with the contradictions in Benjamin's work, and there's always something like personally invested at the same time as it's theoretical on a quite rigorous level. And so I think that the dream kitsch idea is conflicted, and I think that's part of why he leaves it behind, because it's extremely difficult to differentiate dream kitsch from kitsch. And it's not exactly fully differentiated, right? It's a confusion. It's an amalgam in that literal way. Where he wants to, I kept thinking about the situationist, it's actually a surrealist idea, but that's another story, the word détournement, which is where you take a given thing, especially a commodity, and you keep its form, but you twist its meaning. So I think this is just a personal reading of the content of this period of these essays, which I think are a suite of essays that are related. I don't think you could just read, you have to read, in my opinion, ideally, Benjamin's reception of surrealism through his profound interest in children's subjects at this time. And so I think there's two things going on. One, he is interested in childhood consciousness as such, whenever that may be. That's out of time, right? That a childhood consciousness that is actually not pierced by temporality, in a sense, a kind of suspended timeless zone that is going to be replicated, maybe that's a bad word, but that each human child would have this kind of power. And juxtaposed with his own childhood, which is superior to the stuff that's coming out afterward, right? So from here to, let's go to the Rollbahn-Tafel, we know what it looks like, but from here to, bear with me, here. Let's just get to this. It's like definitely, this is a catalog for teachers advertising something, but it's pretty rigid. This is a little weird for sure. I don't really know what's going on this page. Maybe somebody can tell me. It's weird enough that it attracted Ernst and Benjamin, but increasingly into the 20th century, there's this failure to recognize the elasticity of the child mind, and or like what may be a conspiracy theory desire to control children and shape them for modern purposes. And so it's like a two-sided critique and kind of celebration in that way. And that's why the outmoded for him, it's a kind of an opinionated idea, because he's saying, the outmoded is from when I was young, and it could save us. Like the outmoded could cure us of this truly mass-produced kitsch. Like the old kitsch is like, okay, you know? So that he's condoning this earlier form of capitalism, which he does also with the arcades, and he romanticizes the first form of the shopping mall. You know, he's like, in a way, I see the arcades as a commentary on the genesis of the shopping mall. He thinks they're great, you know, and they're a dreamscape of capitalism. So to answer more specifically about nostalgia, I'll try to be brief. Sorry, I'm often long-winded in questions and answer period, but I see dream kitsch as a critique specifically of nostalgia, right? So it's a great German word, also nostalgia, very important for romanticism, and he's trying to find new ideas or categories that can kind of like attack the old ones and set apart what maybe call avant-garde thinking or experimental thinking from earlier forms of modernity. And I think self-consciously as a German, he sees the need to break with this. And so I would see it very generally and simplistically speaking as a critique of nostalgia, if that makes sense. So that the idea is not to be homesick for the past or to long for what is gone, but to use the past, detour it, to enter it as an adult if you can through something like this, to use the materials of the past, the remainders of the past, to get to a space in the present in your mind. So it's like prefigurative in that sense that you're only using the past to break into a new experience of the present. Because as usual, there's this like temporal conflict that's like a dialectic that's always there in his thinking. I don't know, I would love to hear what anybody else would say about that, especially you know about the explosiveness of the mechanism he's trying to establish here. And I don't think the surrealists would agree with any of this, actually, but.
I'm not entirely sure, but I think you might be projecting a little bit too much into his own interest in children. He's interested in himself and interested in, I think what you are talking about, the way in which, and I actually said that at the end, the way in which we can sort of revisit some idea which is phantasmagorical, it's not real, of our own childhood, and how that can somehow dislocate us or take us out of time.
Yeah.
And then make us perhaps do something different, you know, or create some sort of dialectical distance, or you see the past, the present, and perhaps potential. But it's not. I doubt whether he thinks that children are the future of humanity. If that was the case, I'm sure the biographical figure would have potentially invested more in them.
Interesting. But he's not interested in memory so much here, I don't think he's so much interested in his own memories. The memories are merely a vehicle by which
I agree. Yeah. But I mean, you know, there is I think Renoir sort of touches the good point. He's thinking about the image adults construct about their own childhood.
Okay.
And then the question becomes, how do we sort of have supposed adult people revisit the supposed purity, because I also don't think he has this idea that children are blank, are timeless. I mean, these are very romanticist projections, as if children can also not kill animals and do all sorts of things, even when.
Isn't it? I find that there's kind of implicit criticism of this idea of attaching innocence to childhood.
Yeah, but it opens up only, by seeing it as an adult, not as this, It's saying that potentially children are also just not the future, because they are allowing to sort of let themselves be molded in this docile fashion.
He definitely doesn't think that they really have a choice. Yeah.
So, I agree with you, the ambivalence is there.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, what is the primary audience he's thinking of? Is he really talking here about what it means for children to be confronted with these images? I don't think so. He's talking about what it does to adults, and that sort of colors the reading a little bit differently.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's I think ultimately this little essay is quite pessimistic about the world, but then there's a kind of ecstatic experience that the ecphysis, the description of this work, it's literally an escape route for him in this little essay. And I think to make really larger claims about how this affects his thought as a whole would be mistaken. But here, at this moment, there's this possibility of redemption through the given materials, through the constriction, which is very exciting for him and relates to how he understands surrealism as a kind of revolutionary or liberatory project. And so he pulls in the Breton in particular from the manifesto, who agrees that there's something about childhood, the experience of it as we might, understand it, project onto it, that could be a countersphere to modernity or capitalism.
Also, there's still a teacher.
He's there.
Yeah, he's still there.
And he's not in the dreamscape. He refuses, right? Absolutely. Yeah.
He's actually commanding these children.
Maybe so. Molly, does anybody know there's a book by Molly Nesbitt that talks about Duchamp that also, it's in the French context, talks about, she's a great writer, the kind of repetition of writing that children had to do in France and this kind of specific drawing programs in the early 20th century, and relates that to the ready-made and the notion of the ready-made as a kind of, a kind of thought that is imposed upon us by society in a way that we don't even realize, right? So this is in the kind of same line of that idea that obviously Duchamp does it in a very different way than this, right? But these are ready-mades of a kind, and using found collage materials is another way of repurposing capitalist culture. What were the
This one lends itself so well because they seamlessly transform the kind of young boys looking out into
they're
the
looking
distance.
out.
Yeah,
they're not writing. They're looking. They're shading. He talks about that. They're shading their eyes from the sun. Yeah. And is this a church in the distance? Do you think?
But I think, sorry, the landscape, I'm just, the more I look at this landscape, the more it reminds me of First World War front landscape with a balloon and a bomb hanging just above a North French or Flemish village.
Yeah.
And the children look like army people who are trying to overview
Saluting or
destruction.
something. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So
it just grew on me when I was looking.
Yeah. If you look at that Ernst Bloch essay that also, that I mentioned that talks about these images as ruins, there's a little bit more of a kind of post-war consciousness that's like, you can actually kind of see it in the essay, that he expands upon this. And then of course Adorno takes from both of them when he writes later on about Ernst's collages, not these, but the ones that he does under Surrealism. I don't have any of them here. You probably know that Ernst does a series of amazing collage novels that are more, the collages are sort of much more dense than this visually, but Adorno writes about them as sort of strange ruins that do create this difficult to determine and experimental form of temporality / consciousness. Yeah, they're like catalytic images, and they have this ability to change something in the mind, or at least stop the typical processes of thought or experience. But yeah, that's a really great point about this little image. I mean, Ernst was a veteran, and sort of the big one. On the German side, and so was Eluard. On the French side, Eluard, he received the Croix de Guerre because he was shelled and was buried under dirt and had his dog tags blown off. They thought he was dead for a while. So these are, it's kind of an amazing text in that regard, repetitions, because it's a German veteran and a French veteran collaborating. They also have the same lover, it's a menage a trois. I think well, actually this might have just predated
It was
that.
before.
Yeah, it's just before, yeah.
They go
It's
following
afterward.
22.
Yeah. So the next book, because they do another book that's related to this, so it's just before, but they're becoming very, very close in their collaboration and in their lives, and I think enjoyed that, like frisson of here we are, two soldiers on the opposite sides. So that's a great point. Thank you. Yeah.
Any other questions from the pedagogues?
Yeah, maybe to come back to the idea of the pedagogy and the idea of the progressive pedagogical movements at that time, because in those movements too, you see the kind of the moving away from the text towards the image. And of course, in pedagogical literature beforehand, in dialectical literature, there also were images, but they were most often used as kind of illustrations. And what's happening towards the turn of the century is that these illustrations are really becoming the learning. And that's, for instance, in Dutch, I don't know how to translate it, but it's labeled as aanschouwelijk onderwijs. So you have to look at it and then you can understand it. And that's really a kind of widespread cliché almost in lots of pedagogical theories of that time. And I was wondering if there is a kind of connection, and connected to that, you mentioned the image in the text by Benjamin. I haven't read them, and I was wondering, is he talking, when he's discussing children's literature, also about the texts, or is it just the illustrations? And what is he telling about the text in relation to the illustrations?
Yeah, that's a great question. In those other essays that I mentioned, he's mostly in this suite of essays that I've only very briefly told you about. Let's go to one of the publications. He is mostly he's fascinated with the images, and that's why he insists that they're there whenever possible, when he manages to get them published. But he is also interested in word-image relations. And that leap is part of what you're talking about. The leap into how the image forms language and how language forms the mind is the process that he's critiquing, or wanting to analyze as a space of possibilities. As a space that would allow interference with the given, the known, and so I mentioned briefly like his relationship to pedagogical theories in Germany in the early 20th century before World War I. Because as a very young man, he's fascinated by this, and he does think a little bit about it. But I don't think at that point yet I don't know of anything extensive that he writes. But in terms of the text. So for instance, like in the Dream Kitsch essay, he doesn't even mention Adelard's poems, really. There's like, it's really about the images, but he does understand that the Adelard and Ernst working together kind of creates this, what would I say, like a kind of sensual experience of the poems, that the images change the poems for him. And in the books, this is why I kind of have this image where you see explicitly it's about the relationship of image to word, or image as embodying the word, or kind of delivering the word, if you will, to the child's mind. He focuses on that, but he's not really into the story. So he actually, if anybody can find it, let me see if I can get to my Leporello slide. I think it's behind us. Sorry, I don't remember what order they're in. He compares this book, Repetitions, to a specific accordion book, Leporello book, called The Dream, which is probably an early 19th century book, but no one can find it. And if I could get my hands on this book, then we would have a direct, I know this is like really nitpicky, but we could have a direct comparison of whatever old book he was looking at to the Ernst book, and I don't know if the Leporello, The Dream had any words or not, but he was using it as a specific, comparison. But he doesn't spend much time with the stories of the texts. Yeah.
And maybe an interesting detail could be, I've read quite some children's book of that period, in which you really have that kind of trope of the pupils sitting in a classroom, reading in their textbooks, and their attention is totally drawn to the image, and they start imagining all things on the basis of that image. And that's really a kind of trope in lowbrow, middlebrow children's books. It's not very sophisticated, but that the idea of children are looking at their textbooks, they see an image and they start daydreaming and so on. It's really a kind of trope in that kind of literature.
Yeah, it's true.
Coming back time and again, so it's really something of the time, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it definitely harkens back to Romanticism, and that's always important for him. And he's writing the Trauerspiel, which is also about allegories, which are images that are compounded ideas, essentially, right? Usually, they can be textual as well. So he's thinking about these strange image word formations or image thought, Denkbilds, essentially, as I was trying to say. So Yeah, but I think it's sort of like not fully resolved, and then what he wants in this essay and in this at this period, he's trying to use this type of experience or text or kind of learning mode as a way to critique capitalism in general before he's really introduced to Freud and before he's really deep in Marxism. So it's a preliminary version, but what you said is really helpful. Is anyone in the room like an expert on early 20th century pedagogy? Because that would be great to bring into this.
We had one a few weeks ago, but
You're 2 weeks late.
Oh, too bad. Maybe you can give me his name. Yeah, because I think in Germany, in particular, it was a very, I mean, France as well, but I think there was a lot going on, obviously, in the early 20s. It was reformed, essentially, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, thank you.
I'm graduating.
Time for a drink? Okay,
Yay.
there are drinks downstairs. You are all warmly invited.
Thank you.
This is the first